Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers de pays étrangers.
This is the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martin. Now, this week's guest is someone I first met when I was on the board of trustees of the Franco-American Center in Manchester, and I have been frequently asked when I will have her on the show. Dr. Katharine Harrington is a professor of French at Plymouth State University, where she has taught since 2010. She's the author of Writing the Nomadic Experience in French and Francophone Literature. She is a co-founder of the Bienvenue au New Hampshire initiative and currently serves as the president of the American Council of Quebec Studies and the president of the New Hampshire chapter of the American Association of Teachers of French. She's also one of the authors featured in the book French All Around Us, French Language and Francophone Culture in the United States. Kate, welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks for having me on.
Sure. So let's start with your story. So where are you from?
I grew up in Beverly, Massachusetts. Yeah, so it's a city of about 40,000 people. And when I was growing up, it was pretty mixed, kind of middle class, and I would say, ethnic groups, lots of Irish, lots of Italians, Franco-Americans, etc. And and I actually grew up in the neighborhood that was in the shadow of a former shoe machinery mill. We called it the Shoe. It was right behind my elementary school, and we would ice skate on their pond, which was probably some polluted, gross thing. That was kind of
safe.
And that was kind of my only knowledge of what the Shoe was.
So you didn't grow up with any of this French language, culture, heritage, any of that?
Not at all. And no one in my family speaks another language except for maybe one aunt who speaks some French from college. But so it's just something. I'm kind of the outlier in my family.
No, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So when did you learn French then?
So I was lucky enough to have a great middle school French teacher. So started learning French in 7th grade up through high school. I just loved it from the beginning. My teacher was Madame Levesque, and she was actually Italian, but her husband was French Canadian. And
cool.
And in college, in high school, had a wonderful French teacher who also taught Latin, which I did as well. And so it's just something that I loved. And in high school, we also had the opportunity to have a study exchange program with another high school in France, just for 2 weeks. And so I had somebody, I hosted someone at my house and then went and stayed there for 2 weeks. And I was hooked. That was
That's
it.
Awesome.
And my family, I brought up with the great family and we did lots of things, but we didn't travel abroad. That wasn't something that I was brought up with. So my first taste of a foreign language and a foreign country and being in Paris and whatever, I was just like, this is amazing.
You told a real fun story in their chapter about you and a friend getting together and doing the whole looking at the back of the French book and checking out the words. That's cool. Can you tell that story? I started laughing. I read that. I thought that was cool.
So I wonder if she's still around. I'm sure she doesn't listen to French Canadian podcast, but her name was
missing out, dude.
Yeah, you never know. We were both in love with this French class, and I think it's just there's something about when you're a kid and this it almost feels like this like secret code or something, And so we would, when we got our first textbook, I distinctly remember us. We would go to the very last chapter in the book, and we would try to pick out like a dialogue or something with like the hardest language in the book, and then we would, with our old tape recorder with the cassette, we would record ourselves reading it, and we had no idea what we were saying, and it was really fun to go back and listen to those later because it was like,
I bet.
No idea what I was saying. I just love that, trying to get those words to fall off my tongue. It was fun.
That's awesome. So what made you decide then that you were going to try to continue your education in French after high school?
Yeah, I always knew that I wanted to continue. It's strange because it was a passion for me very early on. And yet I think like a lot of students, it was never really explained to me sort of what one could do with it. Those are air quotes around that. It was, I even much more today with the college students that I see, but even back in my day, there wasn't a clear career path to what one would do with French. So whenever I would say to somebody, that I loved French, and that it was probably gonna be something I would study in college. And they would say, "Oh, do you want to be a French teacher?" And I'd always answer, "No way, I'm not gonna do that. I want to do something more exciting than that." Right? I actually really loved the law, and I didn't follow you there, but I long had thought about going to law school. And in college, I did a double major it was called government at my school, and French. And I did, an internship with the public defender's office. And then after graduation from college, I worked for a law firm in Boston for a couple of years. And I worked in a bilingual law firm. And as much as I still think I could have enjoyed the law, right? But I kind of had this revelation during that job that there are tons of lawyers in the US. And yet there are so few people who speak another language. So I was like the only person in the law firm that spoke French. So
wow.
I dealt with all the mainly Haitian clients. I don't speak
Sure.
Creole, but we could communicate enough. I also speak some Spanish, so that was helpful to me there. So it was one of those things that it wasn't kind of till maybe 3 years post-college where I said, you know what, as much as like I think I could go to law school and do that, I think the thing that I have that's always been my passion that fewer people have is my love of languages, and French in particular. So I decided to go to law school. To graduate school.
Yeah. No, that's cool. And I wanted to touch on also, because you mentioned that couple-week trip you took when you were in high school, but you also took a pretty awesome experience when you were doing your undergrad college life for that year. Can you talk about that? That sounds like just a crazy experience. If I was that age, I would have been in heaven.
Yeah, I did my undergraduate degree at St. Lawrence University, which is a small liberal arts college in upstate New York. And what was really cool about that school, and one of the reasons why I chose it, is it had a real strong emphasis on global education. I think 75% of students at St. Lawrence study abroad.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Yeah, which is huge. I mean,
yeah, for sure.
The schools where I've taught at, it's a huge number. And not only that, but the French program, it was a long-standing study abroad program. It had been in place already probably for 30 years, I think, or 50 years, maybe, when I was there. And it was a year-long program. And that is, unfortunately, pretty rare these days that students go abroad for a full year. And it's honestly just, that's really anybody who's gone abroad for that long knows that sort of those first, so let's say semester, because I was on a college schedule, that first semester, you're just really struggling through, right? And you're trying to find your way, and you're trying to communicate, and everything feels really overwhelming for so long. And it's usually right around Christmas, January, that you just starts to click for you. And it's really the second semester where you start to feel comfortable and you really make huge gains in your language acquisition. So, and I was able to we lived with the family, we all had homestays, and I had a number of core classes that were just with international students, but then we also took a couple classes integrated within the larger university, which is just a huge eye-opening experience, so different.
No, that's so cool.
Yeah.
I know it's fun because I did actually a semester in Ireland when I was in law school, and just being able to take classes along with people studying to be lawyers in Ireland, like you said, it was completely different. It's super neat. I can't even imagine with the whole other language trying to go to school with people in France. No, what town were you in?
I was in Rouen, which is in Normandy. Yeah, so it was actually a great location because we're not far from Paris. So you could, if you wanted to do weekends in Paris, we weren't far, not about an hour to the coast, and but the Norman countryside is just gorgeous. So it's a really cool place. Yeah,
I've told people before, I took one of those Viking river cruises once. My family did, from Paris out to Normandy and back, and that was my favorite stop. That town was amazing. It's like a medieval town. It was so cool.
Yeah, super cool. And it was really is one of the few cities, it's pretty well preserved from, so many places were bombed out in World War II, and Rouen is still in pretty good shape.
Yeah, no, it still has a lot of that old architecture. Yeah, super neat. Very cool. All right, so you decide then, law's not going to happen. What was the next step then? You're like, you know what, I'm going down this road, pursuing this French. French is my real passion. Where'd you go from there?
right after college, before I went working in a law firm in Boston, I spent a year in South America. I spent a year in Ecuador. A friend of mine from college. She was a Russian major. I was a French major. And we both had started just senior year, like, let's learn another language. So
let's go to Ecuador. Sure. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I took like 1 year beginning Spanish, my senior year. And then we were like, hey, let's go somewhere where we can learn it. And we didn't want to go to Europe because we both spent a year already. So so I did that for 8 months. And so my Spanish was decent. It was pretty good.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And for some reason, it's like always stayed just a little bit out of reach for me, at least now. That at that point, I was a pretty good Spanish speaker, but French is like so ingrained in me.
Sure.
So because I had that Spanish as well as the French, I was thinking about doing a degree in comparative literature, which is where you kind of choose 2 languages. But in the end, I ended up getting, it's a long story, but I ended up getting a scholar or like an offer to be a teaching assistant that came with free tuition and a stipend. At Texas Tech University, which
very cool.
I actually hadn't even applied there, but so the chair of the language department there used to be at Penn State. They had accepted me, but they didn't have funding for me. Got in touch with this buddy. And so anyway, so I went sight unseen to Lubbock, Texas for 2 years.
That's amazing. Big football program.
Yep. And I have, I've lived, at that point I had lived in France for a year and in Ecuador. And I had never felt more foreign than I did when I lived in Lubbock, Texas. But, a great place. And it was a great launch pad for my career. So met some great people who I still very much am in touch with today. And then from there, I applied for PhD programs and I ultimately ended up choosing to go to Brown. And cool. So that's where I did my doctorate. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's funny you say that because I know my sister's first job out of her undergrad was in Fort Worth, Texas. We used to talk about it all the time. Like even when I was in Ireland, my cultural adjustment was way less than hers was going down to Fort Worth.
Exactly.
No,
yeah.
Very, very cool. So I had a question. So you have all this background now. You're learning French in various different places. You now get a PhD, expert pursuing your passion, French literature. How much of this study was about Quebec versus how much of this was about France?
Yeah, good question. So coursework wise, I had 0 classes on Quebec, North American French, nothing. That was never an option to me, undergrad, master's, or PhD. So that's 3 programs. I did for my master's program, our last semester, we could do a master's thesis, and I wanted to learn about Quebec. And so I ended up writing a thesis on Gabrielle Roy, on her literature and sort of the feminist and nationalist elements of her literature. So, and I worked with my advisor who was actually Algerian. So I knew a lot more about North African French communities than I did about North American, right? Wow. And it's funny because both my master's thesis advisor, my advisor in my master's program, and my dissertation advisor both are Algerian.
Oh, wow.
So which is really cool. And I'm very interested in that part of the world. I've never traveled there, but would love to someday. Yeah. So the only Quebec stuff that I did was kind of on my own initiative, on my own independent research. And that advisor, he was excited about me doing that and pursuing that, but it wasn't anything that he knew much about. So yeah. And so this is something that I've been very cognizant of now that I'm a French professor and thinking about, what was available to me and what I think students should be learning in a French curriculum.
And why, it seems kind of crazy. I guess you can almost understand Texas Tech, but going to school in upstate New York and going to school in Rhode Island, plenty of influence of Quebec culture, heritage in those places. How is it? Why do you think that there was not more offerings for you to learn about the Quebec side?
So at St. Lawrence, my undergrad, we were so close to the Canadian border.
Right.
That, there would be weekend trips. You could go to Montreal for the day and
I'm sure there were.
Go to the bars on St. Catherine Street.
Yes,
there was a lot of that. We were really close to Ottawa. I had one professor, I think he had some background in Quebecois stuff, but there was never a specific course on it. So he might bring it into like a language class, but sure. I never really learned anything about it. And then, so for that one, I really don't know. I think it's because that French program was small, like a lot of colleges are. And, you really are, you build your program kind of around who the faculty are and what their specialty is, what their interest is. And so you'll see places where, you know, people are totally into like Caribbean literature or Maghrebian or, you know, whatever it is, that's their thing. And so maybe that'll be the kind of courses that are offered because that's what that faculty member is specializing in. As far as Brown, that one is like still a little bit of a mystery to me because it's a big program. There's a fair amount of faculty members there. Great French program. I mean, I had a wonderful experience there. I don't think I told the story in the book, but when so I'm jumping ahead here in my bio.
It's cool.
My first teaching gig was in Fort Kent, Maine. I'm sure we'll talk about that. But
yes.
One of my colleagues there it's a very, very small school. So one colleague, he was a math professor, right?
Nice.
Roger Roy. And, but Roger Roy, but you know,
sure.
and when I first met Roger, when I showed up there and he's, I heard you coming from Rhode Island. He said, I'm from Rhode Island. I said, oh, cool. Whereabouts? He said, Pawtucket. I said, no way. That's right, you know, right next to Providence. And I said, oh, that's where my dissertation advisor lives actually in Pawtucket. And he told me about how he grew up going to a French Canadian school, and you know there was a French Canadian parish, and he went to the parish school. It was a bilingual school, and he talked about how his parents made it very clear that he was not allowed to go to any of the Irish, you know, Friday, you know, Saturday night dances or whatever. That you know they needed to bolster the French Canadian one.
Absolutely.
And so he lived in this, you know, in this very French, and he was, so when I was, I don't know how old he is now, but he might be close to 80 at this point. I think he was in his 60s when I knew him at Fort Kent. But I remember going the next time that I saw my dissertation advisor when I was visiting Providence, I said, oh, this is so funny, but this guy that I work with, he's not a French professor, he's a math professor, but he speaks French. Sure. He grew up in Pawtucket and in this French Canadian environment, and he went to a French, you know, an immersion school and French parish. And my advisor just kind of looked at me like, interesting. And like, that was it. It was like end of conversation. And it's like, I don't know, there was sort of no interest there. And I was really confused by this. So it's this thing where I think Research One institutions where they have graduate programs, I mean, people are so focused on their very specific research, you know, area. And I don't know, maybe they just don't have time or what, but it seems like the trends in French education as far at the like PhD level are really, people are definitely interested in La Francophonie, sure, larger outside of France, but the more trendy things are Caribbean or African lit. I don't know why.
Yeah, I mean,
American French is not trendy and cool, but.
I mean, which I understand, but I mean, especially Brown, because I've never been to, I don't know upstate New York at all, but my sister went to Providence College, so I'm at least familiar with that town. And you could have just gone in your car, driven 10 minutes, and you could have had entire conversations in French with people about French literature. It just would have been the Quebec French. And I think that's kind of crazy that wasn't more a part of that experience. But no, that is nuts. So how did you end up at Fort Kent? We talked about that.
Yeah. So unfortunately, although French is my passion and wanting to be a college French professor was the thing that I had decided I wanted to do, it's a very limited job market, and sure, much more so now. But even when I was finishing up, I was 2004, not a lot of jobs out there. And so first time around, I didn't get a job. Normally there's like a cycle where you go to this conference, and I had some interviews, but nothing came through. And then the Fort Kent job came up kind of after the cycle was over. And so I applied for it. And I remember reading the description of it with my husband. My husband's from France. And
cool.
Yeah. And he was like, wow, they described it as a bilingual, bicultural community. And he was like, that's super cool. This is cool. Let's go for this. And so this is something I knew nothing about.
Sure.
I literally did not know that there were French speakers in Maine. Anyway, so yeah, applied for that job and got it. And we decided to move up there, and we lived there for 6 years. And yeah, it's an amazing place.
Yeah, for those who may not be familiar, where is Fort Kent, and what was the reality you saw when you got there versus what you were told it was going to be before you showed up?
So I had very little understanding of anything. I mean, I had been to Portland, I had been to Booth Bay Harbor, I'd been to sort of coastal Maine. And, Fort Kent you drive to Bangor, which is already pretty far. And then you get on Route 11 and you drive for 3.5 hours north of Bangor, Maine. Yeah. And, and because of that, it's such a neat place, but it's almost like an island community in some ways, because they're so isolated and there's not a whole lot between Bangor and the St. John Valley. So the Valley has a really distinct culture. It's a really neat place, but it's so far off the beaten track that, it really doesn't have a lot of tourism.
Sure.
There's not a lot of people just, moving in just because they decide to. It's a lot of families who've been there for generations. Yeah. And the weekend that we went up to go look for a place to live, it was in June, and we drove up. And that weekend, I had never seen a moose in my life. And we saw in that one weekend, we saw 13 moose.
13 moose. No,
we were
might have been enough for me to tap out right
going?
now.
It was it's
I'm
crazy.
done. Thanks. It's been nice, but this will be the moose for me. Wow, that's nuts.
Yeah. Around here, people always want to see a moose, and they try to find one. And up there, it's like you do not want to see one, right?
Because I have zero interest.
Yeah.
I'll look at pictures. Yeah. No thanks. No, that is very, very cool. I mean, Mike and I have talked about it for a long time, because Dr. Patrick Lacroix is up there now. So we owe him a trip up to check out Fort Kent. We promised that we would. He's going to be listening to this, so I'm sure he's going to hold that against me. Sure. But one of the things you mentioned is the whole topic that definitely rang true for me when I was reading it, the conversation between the Valley French and the Parisian French. What was that conversation like? Because it does seem similar to a lot of things that I've heard on this podcast before.
Yeah. And so here I am, somebody who's just done 3 degrees in French, right?
Right.
And, I've lived in France at this point for 3 years of my life. I spent 2 years during my PhD program also in France. So, consider myself a near native speaker of French. I go to the St. John Valley, where I know that, New Brunswick is just next door and Quebec is right next door to that. And so I know that there's a Canadian influence there, but I didn't actually realize how many people in the town of Fort Kent are French speakers themselves. So I can remember walking around the campus for the first, not even just the campus, but we ended up buying a house there, and people, you've never lived in a more friendly place in your
life. That's awesome.
Oh, the first week we were there, we called them slow drive-bys. People knew that there was a new couple moving into this house. And people would drive by our street, slow down, and they would say, "Welcome to Fort Kent," and then keep driving. And then literally probably within the first 6 months we lived there, I felt like I knew everyone in the whole town. I mean, just
that's cool.
Amazing. Yeah, a really, really neat place. And the fact that I was the French professor, I think that helps, right?
Didn't hurt, sure. Yeah.
People really wanted someone who was there to promote and support French. But when I would meet people, so either on campus or neighbors or whatever, and people would tell me that they said, "Oh, you're the French professor." They're like, "Oh yeah, I'm French too. I speak French." And then they'll say, "Oh, but I speak Valley French. I don't speak Parisian French." And I would always kind of be like, "I don't speak Parisian French. I lived in Normandy and Lyon. I don't really have Parisian French, but okay." And then my husband is from France. And so then I would say, "Oh, Pierre-Yves is French." And they'd say, "Oh, Français de France." And, so it's different, right? Everybody's got their own different kind of roles. But I can remember the first day walking around the campus. I'd been hired and I was getting the real tour now that I wasn't just an interviewee, but I was, the people I needed to meet. And the registrar at the time, Don Raymond, I think he's retired by now, great guy. I remember he was so friendly and so excited to meet me. And he went on and on and on and on to me in French. And I was just sitting there like, I didn't really understand what he was saying. I mean, he spoke so quickly and his accent was unlike anything I had heard before. Similar to Quebec French, but its own different kind of feel. And I can remember thinking, "Oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? I'm a total fraud." Here I am thinking I have a PhD in French and I can't understand what this guy is saying. But, it didn't take long, right? It's one of these things. And people say this all the time when I tell them that I, teach courses on Quebec, or I'm bringing students to Quebec or whatever. And then they'll say, "Oh, I have some high school French, but I went up to Canada. I couldn't understand a word they were saying," And that's now the thing that really gets to me, right? but it's really just a question of just training your ear. I mean,
Sure.
if you were to go to Scotland, like I would have a hard time understanding people for a few days, and then I'd figure it out. It's the same language, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. I had been to Scotland. My dad and my uncle, we ran into a bartender from Glasgow. Had zero idea between the three of us what he was saying. Like, he was definitely talking to us in English. None of us could understand. We literally just had a point to what we wanted because our communication was that. But no, I get that. But I'm curious now though, because I know I even run into it here, and it's like even with family members, where they talk about, the French they spoke growing up versus the, as you say, Parisian French. A lot of times, even amongst them, they've been told for so long that it's a lesser French that they almost see it that way. That like if somebody comes in speaking, and obviously not everyone does, and my dad never bought into this, but there's plenty of people who do absolutely think that if somebody comes in speaking the Parisian French, that it's like a proper French. So is that similar, different? Is that the same thing you saw up there?
Yeah, oh, for sure. There's almost like this inferiority complex when people hear that you're here to be the French teacher. And they also had often encountered French teachers from elsewhere who had this really strict way of teaching and wanted you to speak French in a specific way with a specific accent. I think that that's less so now, but definitely people have heard that. And I'll be honest, if you talk to a Quebecois person who's gone to France, they might say the same thing. They might have been mocked in the street for their Quebecois accent. I mean, it's pretty pathetic.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, to me, if somebody feels that their French is inferior, and if they got that from a French teacher, like that's just such a huge fail for French education. That's just so wrong. And, I think that things have changed a lot. We talk a lot about heritage language learners now. So,
sure.
In lots of languages, mostly Spanish, but we've got plenty of other languages in the US that, with students in that category. And these people are a resource. This is like a wonderful thing that we have in our country, that we have people who have already coming to school with another language, with two languages, right?
Right.
So we really need to be supporting that and helping them develop that and becoming literate in that language if it's only a spoken language at home. I do think that we don't give teachers enough training on how to incorporate, multiple kinds of backgrounds in the classroom. I think it was easier for people to just say, this is the way that we speak French. There's one way to do it. And, it's kind of sad not to leave room for a diversity of expressions and accents and,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've told it before. Like when my parents were, even here in Manchester Central, they were told to sit, and them and all the other French Canadian kids were told to sit on one side of the classroom in their French class so that their French wouldn't pollute the others who are trying to learn the correct French.
Wow.
Yeah. And like you mentioned that story about France, it's kind of another crazy thing. So my mom went to France with a friend of hers, and they were checking into the hotel, and the person behind them in line just happened to be from Montreal, but that person didn't speak any English. And the person from France pretended as though she could not, my mom thinks she was pretending, that she couldn't understand the person's French at all from Montreal. So she refuses to talk to her in French. So what had to happen was the person from France at the hotel desk would speak to my mom in English. My mom would then speak to this person from Montreal in French, who talked to my mom back in the French who spoke in Montreal, who then spoke back in English. I mean, just an insane, I don't know. It seems kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, pretty close-minded if you really think that, you couldn't make an effort to try to understand,
Yeah. No, absolutely. I do want to talk about a course that was mentioned in the chapter, actually, about French for heritage speakers. I think that's kind of cool. So first of all, what is the French heritage speaker, and what was this course about?
Right. So this exists for a lot of other languages. It's pretty rare in French in the US, but so someone whose home language is French. So if they grew up learning French with their parents, and, often you hear, sometimes kids, before age 5, that was the only language that they heard, right, until they went to school. And so if they continue to speak it at home, they've got the spoken French. So my son, for instance, I consider him a French heritage learner.
Awesome.
And
Very cool.
yeah, but never had the chance to study it formally. So when you get someone into your classroom in that situation, like my son going into high school this year, they don't really have the grammar, writing, literacy, so they come with this whole, they can speak it, they know it by ear.
Sure.
So you see a lot of things with, writing things the way that they sound, how,
Right.
how we think that they would be spelled and whatnot. So it can be a little bit challenging to kind of find that right space to help them kind of build off of the great foundation that they have. And it can be overwhelming and intimidating for the other students in the room who are learning it as, monolingual speakers. And so this, kid walks in and he speaks French great, but then again, these other students can conjugate verbs and they can write a complete sentence and all of that. So in an ideal world, like when I was at Fort Kent, we were able to offer a class specific just to those students. And so, which is wonderful because from day one, you can speak entirely in French. And then little by little, you work on, I did a lot through reading short texts and having them kind of write, summaries of things or giving presentations on things and trying to, they ended up having to sort of, everyone kind of had their own path of the gaps that they needed to fill in with French. So it kind of became like writing your own kind of individual learning plan. But one thing that when I was in Fort Kent, I had a mentor, his name is Gil Albert, and he was someone who is a great leader in the community for French. He was the director of a French immersion program that they had at Madawaska for many years. Gil was in his kind of retirement part of his job when I met him. And so he was teaching at University of Maine Fort Kent in the education department. And so he really helped me with a lot of materials, and he had actually created some anyway. But he had also introduced me to Grégoire Chabot and his writing. Yeah. And so I met him pretty early on when I think it was like my first year teaching. There was some sort of a Franco-American conference. I think it was held at Colby, and there were different sort of artists and, writers and whatnot. And so I met Greg then, and we continued to have a friendship over the years. He's just one of my most favorite people in the world. And his writing is fabulous. And one of his books on Jacques Cartier Errant is, I don't know if you know it.
No.
So, oh God, Jesse, you got to read it. So it's a play that's written, it's bilingual, and it takes place in Manchester. And the idea is that Jacques Cartier shows up in, I think it was written in like the 80s. So maybe in 1970s Manchester, and he shows up,
cool.
And he thinks he's in Nouvelle France, and he finds out that he's in New England, right? And so it's a conversation between Jacques Cartier and some local mill workers who are at a bar in Manchester.
That's awesome.
And it's just fabulous. And so I would use that play often, and we would read aloud. And what was so fun for the students is that, it was written in a language the way that they spoke it, and they could really understand it, right? So, and he ended up, Greg ended up coming up with his troupe and doing, because his mother was from Sainte Agathe, which is in the north, which is in the St. John Valley. He grew up in Waterville, but so he loved to come up to the valley. So he would come up with his theater troupe and put on some plays. And it's one of these things that would really speak to people who had this French at home. He really, he's someone who had like multiple registers of French, right? But wrote on, the French, the sort of spoken French that he grew up with. And that was something that was really empowering, I think, for heritage speakers, to be able to read something in a language that sounded familiar to them.
That's so cool. It's fun. I remember before I went to Quebec, I remember thinking, how is it possible that you speak a language fluently and have no idea how to write it? Like, that just did not make sense to me as a one language person. Like, I didn't get it until I went up there, and all of a sudden all these phrases that like my grandmother would say that I'd heard my entire life, when I saw them written, I had no idea what they were. Or if it would have came time to write it, I have no idea how you write imitate Z. I have no clue how to write any of that.
Right.
But yeah, it was kind of, there's just a tiny slip, but at least I understood how that could possibly happen. But
yeah,
no,
it's fun when people can finally figure out how to connect those dots, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Grégoire Chabot. That's cool. I talked to him quite a few times. We just never got the schedule where we could have him on the podcast. It was a bummer, but super, super interesting guy. We just talked. And he was hilarious just to chat with. He was a super funny guy.
So warm and so wonderful. Yeah. He's
at least I get started the podcast early enough to be able to meet him. So that was cool. I definitely appreciate it. But how'd you end up then leaving Fort Kent? How did we end up in New Hampshire? What happened there?
Right. So we were in Fort Kent for 6 years. I just, it's one of those places that will always hold such a special place in my heart. It's people are amazing. We've kept a lot of friends from there. Both of our children were born there. And so, but it was my parents. We're living in Massachusetts still in Beverly, but have now retired and up in New Hampshire. And it was an 8-hour drive to see family. And already my husband's family's, on another continent. So it became really tough once we had little kids and we kind of wanted to be able to see family more frequently. So a position came up and I actually didn't go on a big job search, but I just happened to see that there was a French position open at Plymouth State University, which happens to be 12 miles from where my parents had built their retirement home.
Very nice.
So I applied for it and got it. So so that was in 2010. We moved here.
And what does the French program look like at Plymouth State University?
Plymouth is a small regional comprehensive public university.
Sure.
And we've got about 4,000 undergraduate students. When I started here, we had a Department of Languages and Linguistics. I replaced the one and only French professor. There were, at the time, there were 3 full-time Spanish professors, and a professor of linguistics and TESOL, the teaching of English to speakers of other languages. And then we had some part-time teachers who taught Mandarin, sign language, Italian, German. Sure. So that was 12 years ago. Fast forward to today, we no longer have a language department. Our university has been reorganized around interdisciplinary clusters, which is the brainchild of our president, who has been here maybe 7 years. The concept is interesting. So we kind of take, instead of having sort of these silos of disciplines, the idea is to really force groups together around common interests and to create kind of new curriculum and interdisciplinary kind of projects and ideas. So I ended up splitting off with Spanish. Wow. Yeah, it's kind of weird. So Spanish wanted to go with the criminal justice program in justice and security. And I just didn't feel like I wanted that label for French. And I had been working with the tourism industry. So I am in the tourism, environment, and sustainable societies cluster.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And to be honest, it's been a little strange at times to not have a language department. I'm still very close with it. Right now, there's just one other Spanish professor left, and he and I work well together on a number of different things. But I have really made inroads with other disciplines such as anthropology and geography and environmental studies and sociology and political science. And so I'm kind of a social science person as well, so that kind of suits me. But it's also been really great to have French language and Quebec on the minds of these colleagues who otherwise would never have thought about languages. So it's led to some really fruitful projects and collaborations. And so I don't regret it at all. It's a little odd, especially, I feel like most of my colleagues at other colleges, when they hear that I don't have a language department, they're like, what the heck,
Sure.
It is what it is. So.
Yeah, no, one of my soapbox issues, I still feel that northern New England, New Hampshire specifically here, we're leaving money on the table all over the place because we do not promote the French language nearly enough when we have an entire province of people who we could easily host for all kinds of various things in New Hampshire. If we took our language education more seriously here, I think we could learn a lot from what happens in Louisiana, honestly. It's insane to me that more tourists go from Quebec to Louisiana than do to New Hampshire. How is that even possible? My geography is not great, but it seems a lot closer than Louisiana is. But that's a big frustrator for me. But anyway, maybe this is a good transition. Tell us about the Bienvenue on New Hampshire project. I think it's very cool.
Sure. So when I moved here from New Hampshire, I moved to New Hampshire from Maine, I'd had in mind, I'd been in this bilingual, bicultural border community where everyone was very aware of multiple languages, right? And so there were a lot of signs and stores and, you know, businesses that said, "On parle français ici." Right. It was very visible, right? That because a lot of people there speak French. So, you know, they would want Canadian visitors and customers to know where they could be served in French. And, you know, having spent a lot of time in the White Mountains region, I grew up skiing up this way. And, you know, you see a ton of Quebecois plates on Route 93. I mean, so that was very apparent to me when I moved here. But what was strange is that, like, moving to this town, there's absolutely no visibility of French anywhere. And so I really thought, like, this was an opportunity for my students, especially to learn to be able to speak French for authentic purposes and to have opportunities to use their language skills, you know, in the community and in the business community. Forget when it was exactly, but I went to Burlington, Vermont for a conference and was noticing what they do in Burlington. They have downtown on Church Street, they have a kiosk that's kind of like has French language materials and maps, and it's staffed by a French speaker because they very much, you know, are aware of the lots of visitors that they have coming over from Quebec.
Sure.
I think it's a little bit different. I think about these things a lot and why things are so different here in New Hampshire. But, you know, Vermont has their biggest city in the north of the state, right?
It does.
And so there's a lot of people coming to Burlington because it's a big place and there's lots to do there. And so it's a great place to visit. And so they have a little bit, you know, the resources are more centralized and more well, you know, better developed. New Hampshire is a little bit different. On the one hand, 99% of the border crossings that come from Canada into New Hampshire do not come from Canada. They cross over in Vermont, right? They go through Derby line. We do have one border crossing in New Hampshire, but it's teeny tiny. Right. So I think we're almost like secondhand, right? And so it's a little bit less obvious, I think, to some people, even though we do share a border with Quebec. It's not a frequented border. So that makes things a little bit different. But so anyway, so I became interested in sort of trying to do something in the community. I started with students and with a student project, and there was someone who was running the local chamber of commerce, and I talked to her about it, and she said, you know what, we published this yearly kind of directory of businesses and stuff in the area. What if we did a bilingual version? And I said, great. Yeah. So I took that on as a semester-long project with a class. And we published it, and it was like in all the welcome centers in the area. And it was really cool. It was great for students to be able to see, like, they did this work and now they can see it out there. And so that kind of led to this idea that there's so many more opportunities to do that type of work. So I was put in touch with a couple of people who are sort of like-minded, you know, in this thinking. And Bino La Montagne is the main one. So he works in economic development for the state of New Hampshire, and he works recruiting Quebecois companies to come settle in New Hampshire. And he's a French speaker. And so Bino and I started talking. And then the other person is Chuck Henderson, who is, he works for Senator Jean Shaheen. He is the director of special projects for the North Country. Cool. So, yeah, he's based in North Conway. And so the three of us kind of became this core group around this idea. And we just started to think about, like, what could we do to take this, like, little idea from my French class and kind of get it, further out. And so we did a number of things, but like kind of the main thing that we do is sort of French language workshops and cultural literacy. So just I created a couple of workshops for different industries, mainly for tourism. And one of the biggest things around here is hiking. Sure. So, you know, I live right in the middle of the White Mountains, and we have 48, 4,000 footers, and Quebec does not have big peaks like that. And yet it's a very, very active, population of people. And so a lot of them come down here for hiking. The Appalachian Mountain Club and New Hampshire Fish and Game and the White Mountain National Forest. These are all, organizations that their main focus is on safety. So for instance, if somebody tries to hike Mount Washington and their flip-flops and doesn't bring enough water or whatever, and then they end up having to get rescued off the thing, like, this is major resources, right, that need to be had.
Very, very expensive. Yes.
So that was kind of Chuck's thought from the beginning, was that, one of the best uses for bringing French language services here would be for safety purposes. So we kind of started with that industry. And so I've given a number of workshops over the years to those groups, people who like manage the huts for AMC or frontline kind of tourism workers, and just giving them an idea of like who's coming here, or what, just kind of giving them an overview of like what are Francophone population. So it's not just Quebec, right? French Canadians. How many of them come a year? How much money that represents for our state? And then I always try to kind of make that connection with like, the huge amount of immigration that came from Canada to our state, from mid 19th to early 20th century, and how many people here have French Canadian heritage. So making a connection and an effort with this population of people is not some obscure idea, right? It's not like country somewhere else.
No, right, of course, yeah.
I mean, this is a very natural connection that we have, but as you've mentioned before, like the US is not, like we don't do a great job with promoting and prioritizing language education. So we don't have a lot of people who are really comfortable, bilingual speakers. What we often do, so we kind of give an overview of like, what this population is, why it's important, why we should care, and why we should make a bigger effort. And then we talk about just like the simple things that people can do in their businesses or organizations just to make people feel welcomed, and just to acknowledge, right, that that we have this whole population from another country whose native language is a different one than English, coming to our area. We should just at least like put it out there, bienvenue, like we're happy that you're here. And it's such a like simple idea, and yet it's not done enough. So yeah, and I would always end with just a simple language lesson to give people some greetings and simple things that they can use, and they leave with a little cheat sheet, kind of depending on what their industry was. And what I've found over the years is like what you need to do in a room is like figure out who are your champions for this cause. Because inevitably, if someone is signing up to come to a workshop about French language for tourism, they probably have some connection to that. Either they studied it in high school, they have a meme from, Canadian, like, and inevitably we would find someone in the room and say, yeah, I have French Canadian heritage, or I studied French or whatever. And so it's like enabling and empowering those people to say, you know what, then you should be the one in your organization that wears a little pin that says je parle français, or you're the one who greets people. So so that's about the gist of it.
No, and I think that's so cool. I mean, for me, it's always been frustrating because, I mean, you mentioned you have to go through, Vermont. Most people go through Vermont, but I mean, I could leave here, be in my house, Sherbrooke in 3 hours, or I would leave Quebec City even like 7 a.m. I'd be home in time for lunch. Like, we're still very, very close. I always think we got 100 million hotels going up in Manchester right now. We got new restaurants opening all the time down here. If we just had an option where we could tell these, our friends up north of the border that if you come to this hotel, there will be somebody there who can talk to you in French. If you show up at this bar, there will be somebody there who could talk to you in French. I think that would go such a long way. And I think we're just missing an opportunity to do. Again, I'm on my soapbox, but I dealt cards at a casino at the Seacoast once. And just the difference it made when I'm counting out their blackjack to them in French numbers was huge. Like, I can't even, like, if we just could, and that doesn't seem like a giant sacrifice to me to have a couple places that could do that, considering we have 100 million options down here in Manchester.
Yeah. I'll be honest, having worked in like the tourism industry, I realize there are it's complicated, right? So it's an industry where there's a ton of turnover employee-wise. So you've got that. We had a grant with the Northern Borders Regional Commission that allowed us to have staff, and we did a ton of translations for like 36 different distinct businesses in 11 different towns. We were working just in the northern 3 counties, Coas, Grafton, and Sullivan. But even like all the time that you spend putting into a translation of a menu, for instance, it's like, I mean, the minute somebody wants to update their menu, what are they going to do if they have nobody on their staff who speaks French to do that work, right? Stuff changes so quickly. And so, but I think what you're saying, is like and that's where we have these stickers that you can put like window clings that say bienvenue, whatever. And I think just having some sort of visible symbol, and then if there's someone in that business that can speak some French, that seems to be just, like such a no-brainer of an idea. And I think that's simple enough to do. Some things that require a lot of resources are hard to keep up with. So we feel like a lot of the projects that we did, we were really proud of them at the time. And then they just sort of like, if you're not updating things all the time, then they become obsolete.
Yeah, no, I get it. I guess, I don't know. Again, I don't know this industry, but it just seems to me that if you're going to have, there's like 4 hotels within walking distance of where I'm talking to you right now that were built since COVID started.
Wow.
In Manchester. And there's new stuff going up all the time. And if only just there's one place that just offered that one service, I think it would be huge. I think just an opportunity, but
I agree. I mean, I would love for New Hampshire to see itself as a border state,
right.
And that this is a resource that we have that other states don't have. And,
All right, I think we're on the same page there. I do want to back up though, because I did mention a couple of things in your bio that I want to talk about. Writing the nomadic experience in French and Francophone literature. What is this about?
So this is a book that I published based on my dissertation research. So I ended up becoming really, I wanted to work on contemporary literature. And although, I really like French writers, the people that I was sort of drawn to were writers who are shared between more than one country and more than one language.
Oh,
you can kind of,
sure, that works.
Like personal connection there. The first one that kind of got me on that was his name is Leclésio, is his last name, GMG Leclésio, and he's a very, very prolific writer. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature like maybe 2010 or so, but I was writing about him before that. He's like published by Gallimard, which is like the traditional French publisher of all the legit literature in France. And but when you read his stuff, none of it is really just about France. All his sort of characters are really, they're immigrants, or they're migrants, or they're refugees, or he's in another country, and he himself has lived in Mexico and Morocco and the US. And, so I was just really interested in sort of what that kind of identity, how that is translated into literature. And so I worked on 4 different authors,
cool.
two who are kind of Canada, France based. Nancy Houston is one, and Régine Robin is another. And then I worked on another Nina Bouhari, who's Algerian but lives in France. So
very, very cool. Definitely different. That's awesome. All right, what is the American Council of Quebec Studies?
Really, is this organization? Going through my CV, aren't you?
I got to make sure that I check some of these boxes. Just
cover all bases.
Well, I find it pretty interesting. Like, these are definitely things that I did not know about.
Cool.
I mean, I'm from Manchester. My parents grew up speaking French in the house. I've been doing this podcast for a couple of years, but it was within the past probably 2 months that I even realized this organization was a thing. So what is this organization?
The ACQS is an academic organization that it's sort of the one. There's a couple of organizations in the US that are, so there's AXIS, which is for Canadian studies in the US, and then ACQS is Quebec studies in the US. So it brings together academics, both from the US and Canada and some outside as well, but who specialize in Quebecois, either literature, linguistics, history, social sciences, politics, things like that. And we run a biennial conference, and we generally have about maybe 120 or so scholars, I would say, who attend these conferences. Yeah, so it's just a wonderful group of people, very, very supportive. And I originally was introduced to it by a colleague, Mark Richard, who he was a colleague of mine at Fort Kent, and he has been a member for a long time. And he and I both are on the board now and have been for a while. So it's a wonderful group. Susan Panette has been on the board as well, and
nice.
Lots of the people. So it's
very cool. The New Hampshire chapter of the American Association of Teachers of French. What do you guys do here?
The AATF is the national organization for teachers of French, and each state or region has its own chapter. So New Hampshire has its own chapter. And I was involved in AATF when I lived in Maine. And then when I came to New Hampshire, wanted to check out what was going on here. And as it goes with a lot of these small kind of volunteer organizations, they were like desperately needing board members or officers. So
Sure.
I very quickly became president without, wasn't necessarily part of the plan, but it happened, and I'm still president now 8 years later. But this has been like, honestly, one of the best things that I've done since I've been in New Hampshire, because it's put me in connection with the community of French educators. And there's always a difference between what happens at the college level and what happens at the K through 12 level. I mean, we're dealing with the same kinds of things, and yet our realities are very, very different. In higher ed, we are kind of expected to do service, not just on campus, but to our discipline. And so for me, like, this is sort of part of my job, whereas someone in high school, that's not an expectation for them. So it's a lot to take on something like that. So I'm very happy to do the work, and it's been a great way to get to know lots of fabulous French teachers in the state, to get a sense of sort of what the challenges are, and we try to offer professional development opportunities for teachers. And also, we feel, the group that we have as officers now, we feel really strongly in providing social opportunities, networking kind of events, because most French teachers, unless you're at a very big high school or college, most French teachers are the only French teacher at their school.
Sure.
And you really need to be around your people, right? You need, obviously the internet today, there's a fabulous Facebook group. The French Teachers in the US Facebook page is like phenomenal for getting ideas for things to teach and what's going on in the French speaking world. But you really need to talk to your colleagues, right? And to be able to share your, challenges and frustrations and joys and successes and all of that. So sort of the thing we're most proud of that we created with the AATF New Hampshire is we started an immersion program for teachers. I don't know how long ago, maybe 5 years ago. So up in Colebrook, there is an eco village. You might not know about this. And actually it's Bienvenue La Montagne who had introduced me to this a long time ago.
I have heard.
Okay. So they are fabulous. It's a group of Quebecois. It's a community of Quebecois who they have one eco-village up in Quebec, and then they opened a second one, and they chose Colebrook. They opened up their place to us as a group and hosted us we made a weekend out of it where we'd have workshops, and so they have an organic farm. So we learned, about the shiitake, growing, and we would pick berries, and they would give us a cooking lesson, and we would, have all organic foods, and but it's all French,
awesome.
All French speakers. So it's really fun place to have an event. Plus it's right next to the border. So we would go across to Quebec and have dinner, or go to the Forest de Lumina. If you've never been to that, it's really cool.
No.
So that's been a really, really amazing event. And we've run it every, in September, the weekend after Labor Day, because it's like the kickoff to the school year for teachers. So time to connect and come up with ideas. And we would offer one workshop with something kind of teaching related. Anyway, but sadly, it was shut during COVID. They're a community of people who were just able to just shut off their doors, and I don't blame them, to outsiders. And they've now just sort of changed directions a little bit, and they're not going to be let me know that they're not going to be doing those kind of events anymore. So we're going to be looking for a new idea, because we found that offering this immersion experience of having teachers together, only French spoken for a whole weekend, but a mixture of both professional development and fun stuff.
Sure.
It's what teachers really need. And it really helped us learn, what's going on in schools and what people need.
No, that's very cool. I know I'm gonna have my mom's gonna be teaching French, I think, for the first time.
Really?
A long time. I mean, maybe it might be the first time ever. She's been teaching for history for like 40 years, but her school is offering French next year, so she's gonna be a French class. She's pretty hype about it. So I'll have to make sure that
we'll invite her. Yes.
Make sure she knows about this. All right. So this has been awesome. Very fun conversation, but we cannot end this conversation without the super important topic, something I know you spent a ton of time thinking about, something you wrote about in your book, and that's the future of the French language here in New Hampshire. You talked about some of the factors that may determine the future of the language in New Hampshire. Can you just talk about what your thoughts are on that?
Okay, well, this is important to talk about, and yet it's not going to be the most optimistic part of this conversation.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So, I mean, what's frustrating to me is that, we know research shows that the best time to learn a language is as young as you can possibly get them, right? And
Sure.
so elementary schools ideally should be offering language. There are very few public schools in New Hampshire who offer a language at the elementary school level. And if they do, it's most often Spanish. In my school district, there was one school that offered French at the elementary school level, and when that teacher retired, they ended up hiring a Spanish teacher. I think because that was I think that they put an ad out for French or Spanish, and that's what they found. So there's a couple of things going on. One is that there's sort of this message out there at the college level that maybe, majoring in a language is not useful. And so since I've been at Plymouth State, we no longer have a teaching certification option in languages. We didn't when I arrived in 2010.
Sure.
And so at that time, we had a French major, but there was no clear career path for majors. So it was one of those things that was hard. A lot of students double majored,
Sure.
but we always had pretty low numbers for French majors. And I do really think it's, again, although whenever someone asks me, what can you do with a French degree? I'll say you can do anything with it. I mean, it's
Right.
it's like a plus, an asset in any field, right? This is really true. And I really believe it.
More than I could do with my history degree, I'll tell you that. Sure.
But it's, but given that, that's like not enough for people. It's not concrete enough. And like, let's be honest, college is way too expensive in the US. So parents are looking for the best return on investment of their degree. And I get that. Fewer and fewer students were majoring in French. And so since I have been in New Hampshire, and I've been here for 12 years, the three state campuses, so UNH, Keene, and Plymouth, when I got here, all three had a French major. Now only UNH has a French major. Keene was really the one that was producing the language teachers. They had a great language teacher program. That is no longer happening.
Wow.
So we have a real shortage of
Sure.
teachers. So we're not producing the teachers that we need. And then schools, for the most part, we have French and Spanish at most high schools in New Hampshire. But what happens is that if someone retires or leaves, they often will eliminate the program. And we've seen this happen multiple times since I've been here. And that's partly from a lack of qualified candidates for jobs, but it's also that, some of these schools, the demographics are going down, the numbers are going down. And so schools don't feel like they can support more than one language. And so sometimes they'll just have Spanish. So to me, this is just such an incredible shame. I mean,
Sure.
We are a state where it doesn't get more obvious what a practical application of French is. I would just love for Northern New England to see itself as the place where I feel like every student in the state should have the opportunity to learn French, and it should be from a young age. Unfortunately, New Hampshire does not have a high school graduation requirement for language. I don't know if you're aware of this.
I did. It was not. No.
Very few states in the country do not have this. So, I mean, generally, I went to school in Massachusetts, and you had to have two years of a language to graduate from high school. This is not a requirement in New Hampshire. This is something that they can forgo. So
Sure.
Yeah, so that's a big problem. I've been just, it makes me really sad to know teachers in general are just, faced with so much right now. This is a really, really difficult time to be in education at all levels. And so when you don't have a support group, when you don't have a language
Sure.
department that backs you up, when you're seen as sort of the special, which is like the extra thing,
Right.
It's always the first thing to go. In a lot of elementary schools, such as the one that my children attend and have attended, they have Spanish in school, but it's, they say that they started in kindergarten, but it's like 20 minutes a week. This is not an authentic commitment to language education. It's like, sure, we're introducing it. They have some exposure to it, but they're not going to become speakers of a language if you have to every week, no one has retained anything from what you done last week, right?
Right.
So yeah, so now I'm on my soapbox, but
No, this is important soapbox.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
Yeah, what do we do? So you mentioned before about this idea of like this whole population of French speakers just north of us. So I actually had a conversation with Frank Edelblut, our Commissioner of Education, at one point.
Nice.
He talked about another problem. He talked about how in Coos County, students who are on sports teams have to travel like 3 hours south to go to a basketball game.
For those who don't know, Coos County is the extreme north of New Hampshire.
Exactly. And whereas they could be, imagine a world where you could play basketball with somebody who lived just 20 minutes away, but you had to cross an international border to get there, right?
Sure.
Yeah. And I mean, I would just love the idea of having every student have the opportunity to study French, and for our schools to be connected with schools in Quebec, right? So when I do a lot of hiking, and whenever I'm hiking, I love to kind of pay attention to license plates and whatnot.
Yep.
And I was hiking Lafayette one day, which Lafayette is the most popular one for French Canadians for various reasons, right? It's got a great name, but it's
Absolutely.
also right on the highway. Like you get off 93 and like a parking lot's right there. And it's a spectacular hike. But we were hiking up it and we came across a school group of French Canadians. And I was like, whoa, where are you guys from? What are you doing here? Whatever. And they were from Sherbrooke. Yeah. And she told me that every year that middle school sends school groups. So they send the seventh graders every year hike Lafayette, and the 8th graders hike Washington every year.
That's awesome. Very
and
cool.
I said, oh, do you hook up with a school while you're here and meet other kids your age? And she said, no. She said, well, we don't think there are that many middle schools that study French anyway. And I just thought, whoa, like people are here, they're coming to New Hampshire. Right. Like they know what's cool about being here. And yet we're missing these cultural opportunities, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, from having sent, college students abroad, when they go to France, it's like a really cool experience and whatever. But when they go to Quebec, they end up being able to keep friends there and go back for weekends the next year. Like it's a much more sort of fruitful connection in a lot of ways. So, and I don't know why that doesn't happen more often, but it really doesn't.
Yeah, I guess that's big time part of my frustration is I think when you see sometimes this language, especially the French language programs cut for budget reasons, I just can't think of how short-sighted that is. Long-term potential lost because of stuff like that. It frustrates me, for sure. Yeah, no, that is kind of a bummer way to No, I mean, it's really important. This has been a very, very interesting conversation. So I'm very glad we were finally able to get you on the podcast. Again, talking to you, Dr. Kate Harrington. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation to be on the French Canadian Legacy. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. It's been an honor to be on the podcast.
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.